Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. Today, our conversation is about GDPR compliance when full disclosure becomes a reality. So, Steve, hello. It's good to be speaking with you again. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be discussing what we're hearing on the grapevine, that many global organizations with a footprint in Europe are still unclear if the EU General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which officially comes into effect next year, May 25th, 2018, they're unclear if that applies to them or if they have the right teams and resources in place to meet the requirements. As this countdown looms closer, this must now be a burning issue for global security teams. So before we get into it, can you remind us of the importance of this legislation and who GDPR applies to?
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's probably the biggest shake-up in privacy legislation that we've seen in many, many years. And the reason that I say that is not just because it is far-reaching, but also because it requires a huge amount of effort on the part of organizations to be compliant. And that requires them to really understand specifically where information is being stored, how it's being stored as it relates to individuals. In terms of who it might apply to, then it does apply to any organisation worldwide that handles EU resident information. So if, for instance, you happen to be sitting in, let's say, Hong Kong, and you are holding information that is personally identifiable relating to an EU resident, then the GDPR applies to you. What does that actually mean specifically for organisations? Well, it does mean, of course, that they have to comply with the legislation. It means certainly that they need to be aware of what is required in order to comply. And I think one of the things that tends to catch people out is that it also applies if you're a third-party provider. So let's say, for instance, I'm storing information on you, Tavia, and I happen to be sharing it with somebody else. The responsibility doesn't go away. So I'm still responsible, but the third party I'm sharing it with as well is also responsible. And I think a lot of people are missing that point. So when we look at the kind of work that needs to be done, it's about really understanding what information you store, how you store it, how you protect it. And from an EU standpoint, it's about privacy by design. So building privacy and the protection of that information into systems by design from the outset so that the information is protected at each stage of the information lifecycle. And that is very much easier to say than to do.
Here's a question I'm just personally curious about. This EU General Data Protection Regulation applies to EU residents. Is that going to be in conflict with other countries' protections, other regulations? Or is there going to be a conflict between those two?
Well, what we're starting to see certainly is different countries that hold EU resident data saying, well, look, if the GDPR has set the bar at this level, there's absolutely no point in us trying to not meet it. So it's being used, I think, as a bit of a sort of a bellwether across privacy worldwide. Are we going to see conflicts? I'm not so sure. I think what we're going to see more is perhaps organisations being unaware of the full range of requirement and falling foul from that regard, rather than, I think, regulators introducing different regulations that might be in conflict with it.
It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next few years. What value could businesses derive from implementing GDPR?
Well, I think this is very important because a lot of organisations, have come towards the GDPR looking at it from the perspective of we need to be compliant with this regulation. And for me, that's a mistake. I think organisations have an opportunity to really understand better how you are handling information. It is an opportunity to engage with third parties that you're sharing information with to really understand how they are also protecting that information. To say, look, given that we need to be putting in place certain restrictions, certain visibility, certain insights into how information is being handled, why don't we use that as a means of just resetting, for instance, some of the ways in which we handle information and share information so we have a higher degree of transparency in terms of the way that information is being handled. That has significant business benefit because obviously it gives you a perspective on where your information is, whether it be in the cloud, whether it be held at an individual level. But it also, I think, aligns the regulation with the business very much more. And I think that whilst I'm not saying that GDPR compliance is going to be a business differentiator, I do think that certain organisations who have perhaps got ahead of the game in this area are now better placed because they have such a higher degree of visibility of how they are dealing with information. And that does mean that they can protect it at different stages of the life cycle. It also means that they know what to get rid of once come the day that they no longer need to use it. And that, I think, is very useful.
Interesting. Come May 25th, 2018, what do you think legislators will expect organizations to demonstrate if they experience a breach? And do you think that fines could be levied immediately upon a breach?
I think that when people talk about GDPR, there's a lot of emphasis on the fine. 4% of annual global revenue is obviously a big number for any organisation, and deliberately so. I think, though, that there are a number of other things within the GDPR that I would say organisations need to pay attention to. So, if we take a scenario whereby an organisation has completely ignored the need to observe some of the guidance within GDPR, and they have a breach, then obviously a regulator is going to take a pretty dim view. How they then levy a fine is going to be based on a whole range of different computations that they come up with. If we have an organisation that is on the way to completing a GDPR program and they have a breach, then certainly a regulator is going to be able to look at that and say, okay, we can see that you were making the right moves towards it, so it isn't perhaps as serious as somebody who's ignored it. And then the other scenario will be somebody who has spent the time, spent the effort putting in place the GDPR requirements and is still unfortunate enough to have a breach. And I think in that scenario, regulators will say, well, we know things are going to happen. GDPR was never intended to prevent breaches happening, but at least you've moved as far as you possibly could and you've taken all reasonable steps. If we look into that, then that's how we're going to see, I think, sliding scale of fines. But there are some other things in there. If the regulator is unhappy with what's being done, if no effort is being made to protect personal information, for instance, they do have the ability to close that business down. Arguably, that is a much bigger stick than 4% of revenue.
Given the size of the task and with only 10 months left to implement GDPR, what steps should organizations be taking right now to be compliant?
Well, I think the first thing that people need to do is to really conduct something of a gap analysis. So you need to understand what the requirements of the regulation are and where you are today in terms of those requirements. Because you may well be doing things that are absolutely fine, and so you can tick off a number of those boxes. From that point, you can then begin to really get into what it is that you need to do. You really do need to understand where you're going to focus your resources. Do you have a data protection officer who is monitoring these sorts of things? Some certainly that I'm aware of have undertaken the work. They've done that gap analysis. They've conducted the audits. They've put in place the guidelines. They've made their boards aware of what they've done, and also, of course, perhaps more importantly, their end users as well, because that's key in this too, because we're all using and sharing that information. And for some businesses, it has been a very significant undertaking. There is a requirement, for instance, in the marketing space, for you to be able to demonstrate that individuals have deliberately opted into a specific marketing campaign that you're running. Well, if you happen to be running a large number of those all around the world, for instance, it's no small undertaking. If you happen to be an ISF member, of course, then we've been talking about this for the last couple of years now, and at the end of June, produced the implementation guide around GDPR, which does actually walk you through the regulation. And so a lot of members have certainly made use of that. And of course, if you're not an ISF member, then that doesn't mean to say you can't access the information. We're still quite happy to share that and to work with organisations in this regard. But I think the message is it isn't a small piece of work. And as we get closer to 25th of May, I do expect to see much more flurries of activity taking place as organisations, start to play catch up in this space. And inevitably, I think that's going to involve third parties coming in to help organisations, simply because there isn't the time left to get the work done.
So that in itself is a new industry, the assistance for businesses to become compliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen, service providers offering a range of services in this space. We've seen law firms doing something similar. At the ISF, of course, we provide that level of service as well. I think anybody who works with personal information and information security, is providing these kinds of services because it is such a major undertaking.
So businesses that are looking for a pathway to compliance within the next 10 months might be wise then to consult with the ISF and to refer to the ISF's Preparing for the General Data Protection Regulation Digest, as well as the Implementation Guide on Data Privacy and the Protecting Mission-Critical Assets report. Visit securityforum.org for more information, and Steve, thank you so much for walking us through this most important topic.